you're sharing.
Okay, so maybe other people will join later. Welcome everybody to our symposium on students' transition to higher education and especially the role of the learning environment. My name is Taiga Brahm. I'm a professor for economic education at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And together with Michael de Klerk, we organized this symposium, and we're really happy to have you here, to have our presenters here as well, and our discussant, Licia Kortians. I still can't pronounce your last name, I know, but you can do better later by introducing yourself again. Thank you so much for preparing everything and for being here today. And I'll just quickly jump in and show you what we have here. And now this does not work anymore. I don't know why. So what we will use as a conceptual framework, and those of you who were in the collaborative space that Franziska and I organized yesterday already know this model. It's a model on student engagement by Kahoo and Nelson. And it's a good model to actually organize our presentations. And the model I will only quickly introduce. The important part is here in the middle, the educational interface, where you can see that student engagement takes place, and that's essentially what we want. When students transition to higher education, we want them to have the possibility to engage in different ways. So one aspect, for instance, is the emotional engagement. Another aspect, of course, is the cognitive engagement. So that then comes here on the outcome side, where we have academic and social outcomes. And there are also other factors at the interface, and that's why we focus on the learning environment. And I tried to order the three presentations that are here today, and I will talk about the fourth one in a second, in this model, and we can of course discuss later whether this is a good fit. So the first presentation by Michael de Klerk and colleagues is on examining the role of instructional practices, and I see that as really at the interface of the structural influences, especially here, the culture, the curriculum, and the discipline. And then we have a second presentation by Julia, oh that's hard as well, Ladenpere from Finland, and I see this as at this interface here between the student and the well-being. And then we have the third one, that's our presentation by Franziska Zellweger, Miriam Kocher, and myself on the transition to university in the context of the COVID pandemic. And there we focus on this interaction between structural influences and belonging. So this is the three presentations that we will have today, because unfortunately Tobias Jenert couldn't make it to here. He actually uploaded his presentation online for you to watch. We will not show it because we think that it's more valuable to have more time for discussion. But if you want to watch it, I would suggest to take a picture of this QR code so you can have a look later. And I know that our discussant will also quickly jump into Tobias' presentation. So that's it for now. We will have approximately 15 minutes per presentation, then the discussion, and then in the end we will have time, hopefully, for a longer discussion. After each presentation, I will give room for a couple minutes of clarification questions. So I hand over to you, Michael, and you should find your presentation.
So thank you, Taiga. So I'm Michael Leclerc. I'm from the French-speaking part of Belgium and the Université Catholique de Louvain. And I'm here today to talk a bit more with you about one of my last research, which is entitled Examining the Role of the Instructional Practices into the Transition to Higher Education, a mixed study. Which means that we have quantitative and qualitative analysis in 15 minutes, so it's quite challenging and will be a bit dense. And I would like to apologize in advance for that, but we will try to do this the more clear as possible. And so we will go through three different topics. So we will start with the question of the investigation of teaching efficacy in higher education and in the first year at the university. And we will take some time on the contextualization and the Belgian context. And then we will jump quite quickly about on the results, quantitative and qualitative results. And finally, we will discuss and came back to the discussion, the future perspective and the limitation of the approach, because there is some limitations here. And so maybe let's start with the contextualization. And what could be interesting to know for you is that in Belgium, we are in a very challenging transition when we are talking about the first year at the university, because we have an open access and we also have a high failure rate. That means that around 51% of the students fail the first year at the university, and 22 additional persons fail the year and decide to leave higher education, which means that we have these high failure rates. That could be explained by several elements, but also because the first year at the university is particularly challenging. It's a challenging transition for a student with a lot of new requirements for them, and it could be very difficult for them to cope with all these challenges. And so when we are looking at the literature about academic achievement and the first year at the university, you certainly know that we have a lot of information about the individual predictors of academic achievement, background characteristic, motivation, engagement, and so on. We have a lot of information about that. And we start to have promising research about the role of the learning environment. Some of my research show that it could explain around 15% of academic achievement, so it's not nothing. It could be very interesting to go deeper. And we have different stream of research that really think about this question of learning environment. So going through course experience questionnaire, or maybe the information about active learning and teaching, or descriptive observation of teaching practices, and so on. So we have different perspectives, but we also have different limitations of this literature. The first one is that when we are focusing on studies based on active teaching and learning, is that they don't really focus specifically on the specific dimension of teaching practices, but rather on teaching design, such as problem-based learning, or flipped classroom, or some kind of design like this. And it doesn't directly identify the effect of the specific dimension of teaching practices on academic achievement. We also have another problem and maybe another limitation with the perspective of course experience, because it's often based on student perception of the course, which could be biased, as we have seen in the keynote, for example. And it's also addressing this question with individual level, and so it doesn't take the multi-level investigation of this question into consideration. And finally, we have also descriptive observation of teaching practices with the TDOP, for example, and that could be interesting, but that's mainly descriptive and not based on so strong theoretical models, so it could impede the different conclusions that we can just draw from this literature. And so the idea today is to go a bit further and to present a new perspective of investigation of the teaching practices and build on a model that is based on the literature from secondary education, which is the classroom assessment scoring systems, the class, and the three basic dimensions of instructional quality from Beaumont and colleagues. And so I won't have the time to go in this, because it could take 15 minutes just for this slide. But the main idea is that we divided 4 main dimensions of teaching practices, which is the social emotional support, which is all the teaching practices that really aim at supporting the students in the social emotional way. Classroom organization that really aim at focusing on the productivity of the student and the attention of the student during the course, but also instructional support that aim at guaranteeing the understanding of the students for the lesson, and so that each student are able to follow the lesson and to understand the content. And finally, cognitive activation, which is teaching practices that really emphasize on the deep learning and on promoting deep learning for the students. So that's the basic idea, these 4 dimensions. And we would like to try and to investigate the impact of these 4 dimensions on academic achievement, considering for the effect of individual variables. And so to do so, we made 2 different methods. So the first one is quantitative methods, and we investigate this question among 932 first-year students from different courses. And we investigated, we measure background characteristics, so individual background characteristics, but also instructional environment, so the question about the teaching practices, but also characteristics of the course. And finally, psychological variables, so self-efficacy, course values, surface learning, deep learning, and so on, which is also individual characteristics. And the idea is to see what is the effect of this one on academic achievement, considering for the rest. And to do so, we have used a multi-level analysis, which allow us to consider both the individual and the context level, and we performed 5 different models. In the first model, we just run the models to estimate the variation of academic achievement around, between the different courses, and we can see that there is 27.5% of academic achievement that could be explained by the course, so by the context. So that's quite interesting and quite important, that show that it really deserves attention. And so then we introduce at the individual level the background characteristics, and it's not surprising, but past performance and socioeconomic status are significant predictor of academic achievement at the individual level, so okay. After we introduced the instructional practices, the characteristics of the course, and here we have these surprising results that teacher seniority could have a negative impact on academic achievement. That's quite surprising. But teaching format have a positive impact. And what is behind this notion of teaching format is a format of a lesson that really involves the student in the lesson, student-centered lesson with an active design, I can say. And this could explain 43% of the variation in the course, so that's quite important. And then we have introduced the teaching practices that are here. And what we can see is that it's mainly the socio-emotional support that is divided here in consideration for the student perspective, but also teacher proximity, so teacher care and so on, that have a positive impact, and instructional support, so the provision of structure and the focus on really the understanding for every student. Finally, we add to the model the question of psychosocial variables, and then we can see that some new variable pops out, the variable linked to the discipline, and so productivity and discipline and participation management. And we can see that we have a negative impact of productivity and discipline on academic achievement, which was quite surprising, but a positive impact of participation management, so all the teaching practices that really emphasize on making the course useful, interesting, passioning, and so on. Okay? So that's the results, and that was a bit quick, but I have the qualitative result too, to complement this. And so to complement this first analysis, we made 8 focus groups based on the same students, but 1 year after. So it was a retrospective look about the first year at the university with the same student, subsample of the same student. And 5 teams just emerged from the data. And these teams were the main, I would say, the main characteristic of the teaching practices that are really important for academic achievement according to the student. And we have teacher's care, nonverbal attitude, teacher's flexibility, an interactive lesson, and a consistent evaluation. And so, talking about teacher's care, it's really a key driver of engagement for the students, and it really talks about the fact that the teacher really considers the student and considers his point of view, but also his well-being, and it's really attention. We also have nonverbal attitude, which means that it's not only about the content of the course, but how the course is given by the teacher. So they really talk about teacher eloquence, but also this contagious passion for the topic that really involves them in the course and so on. And so you can relate that to the participation management. That's interesting to see that it's really nonverbal attitude. Moreover, they also talk a lot about teacher flexibility and structure of learning. It was a key driver for them for success, the main driver, and they were all agree about that if you have a teacher that is really structured in the way they give the courses, but is also very flexible and take in consideration the different difficulties of the students, so really instructional support, it will be a real lever for academic achievement and to get engaged in the process. And the four teams was an interactive and entertaining lesson, and so they talk about the structure of the course and also the characteristics. So having beautiful slides, having timely pauses, comprehensive syllabus was quite important for some students. But we have moderate medium agreement about that. It was interesting for some students in the focus groups, maybe more at-risk students, but not for all. The other students told us that was not the main thing. And finally, one very strong point was the question of assessment and evaluation. And they told us that it was really important for them to achieve to have a continuous evaluation and progressive evaluation during the lesson, but also to have very explicit and clear and consistent expectation between the learning task and the final evaluation. And that was a major topic for them. That doesn't pop out from our model. Okay. So, the conclusion? The first point of the conclusion is that here, quantitatively, we can say that instructional practice matters. It can explain around 27% of academic achievement, so that could be interesting. And among this, it's mainly explained by these different dimensions. So active teaching formats. Teachers' seniority and productivity seems to have a negative, unexpected effect. We can discuss about that if you want. But also, and the most important, instructional support. And the participant management, so the nonverbal attitude, but also the provision of interest seems to be very important for engagement. And finally, the students also told us that consideration for student perspective could really matter for their engagement too. So that's really the main conclusion. We can discuss about this much more. About the limitation of the study, we have 2 main limitations. The first one is that here it's only a really broad investigation of instructional practices. We are in different courses with different domains and different disciplines, and the question is the instructional quality really generic or subject specific? That's complicated. And what about the assessment method? We didn't really talk about this, but it seems to be very important. So we have to go a bit further, maybe investigating similar teaching feature or something like this. I don't know. And the other question, and I didn't mention that, but we didn't use students' self-report measure, but teachers' self-report measure of their practices. And so the question is that really reliable? Because they could be a bias of their perception of the practices and what they really do in the context. And the question is, which dimension we measure here can be just measured through self-reported measure, or is it always necessary to have this kind of observation protocol, to have this really objective measure of the teaching practices? But this observation protocol could be a good way to go a bit further and to be more precise on our measure. Okay, that was a bit dense, but that's all from me. Thank you for that. And of course, if you have any question, I think we have 1 or 2 minutes.
Exactly, yeah. Clarification questions, oh, a lot of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. What I'm interested if you can tell us a little bit more about the participants, about the students. And I'm asking if you know that, for example, if you have like non-traditional students, like minorities, or some of the mechanisms of practicing that are useful for majority group doesn't really necessarily fit to minorities. So if you can provide some information.
Okay, so a very interesting question, because it's one of our future perspective is to go to this question of how is it different for different public of students. Here, concerning the students, I can say that it's quite, I would say quite traditional students. So it was really in the traditional course of the first year at the university. So it's mainly based on traditional students. And when we are looking at the composition of a sample, it's quite, similar to the global statistic we can have about our traditional students with the age and with the proportion of gender and so on. So I think it's much more traditional students here. So that could be interesting to test it with another product. Yeah.
Great. Miriam?
In the quantitative data, yeah. So there was this different. Yes, I know, I understand, but it was too complicated to put it in. Okay. Yeah. I did. We did a multi-level analysis with different hierarchical models. Yeah. But sorry if it was not clear. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, quick answer.
A quick answer. So yes. No. I think the main dimension that is very complicated is classroom management, because that's really not the same. And we already tried with an observation protocol. And when we are looking at classroom management with traditional measure of classroom management, it doesn't work at all. So it's very complicated from an observation protocol to have specific measure about that. And so we are much moving to a classroom organization that involves the notion of participation and this notion of interest that we put in there, not only discipline and productivity, because it's quite difficult to measure. And so we are still working on it, but I'm quite sure that it's working like this. And what is really important, and we can see from the observation protocol after is that the dimension that really pops out is this notion of cognitive activation. So this is not so much developed in the other model, but here it really seems to be very important.
But that's, no, you can't ask another question, but it's really an interesting topic to discuss further, and maybe to also think about a collaboration after the symposium.
After.
you will be in touch, but now we hand over, this is my job, sorry. Now we hand over to Julia, and we're really happy to have you here. And where is your presentation?
It's in the presentation folder on the desktop.
Yeah. Here you are. Sorry.
Yes. And then
Here you are. So, thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julia Lahdenperä, and I'm a postdoc researcher at Hamid University of Applied Sciences. And here I'm representing our Learn Well research group. Unfortunately, Vivi, Telesiro, and Lisa couldn't make it to the conference, so you have to just go with me. This is the best you can get. I'm presenting our study, or it's an ongoing study. It's not published yet, on higher education students' self-compassion and its relations to psychological well-being. And first, a few words of motivation. So, in many countries, higher education students really struggle with their mental health and have challenges in their well-being. For example, this has been reported in the Finnish context, both from the student health services perspective and also like policy documents, and also in higher education research. Also, as Mikhail explained or said, we have these challenges for the first year, and the transition to higher education is very challenging. So my point here is that there is really a need to pay more attention to students' well-being during the higher education, during the entire higher education experience, but especially during the first study year, and because of this challenging transition that the students have gone through. Furthermore, we've had this global pandemic, if you've noticed, and it has further challenged the student well-being. There is even more, more of these well-being challenges for students at the moment. We have, for this study, we have taken the theoretical notion of self-compassion, and we look well-being from that perspective. So self-compassion refers to an orientation to care for oneself, and it is rooted in Kerstin Neff's work since during the past 20 years or so. And Neff has had initially identified 3 dimensions of self-compassion, and each of those dimensions consist of positive and negative ends of the dimension. So the first dimension is self-kindness, which is the positive one, and then the other end of that dimension is self-judgment. The second dimension is sense of common humanity, and the other end is isolation. The third one is mindfulness, and then the other end is of identification to your own problems. Neff initially proposed this sort of 6-factor structure for self-compassion. So each of these 6, 3 dimensions with 2 the positive and negative ends as being individual factors. But in data study, for example, in Lopez and colleagues, they did the validation for those negative, or they combined all those positive items from self-kindness, common humanity and mindfulness, and then combined them into the factor of self-compassion, and took the negative dimensions, self-judgment, isolation, and over-identification, and combined those as the factor for self-criticism. So we can use or view this self-compassion in 2 ways, and they both exist at the same time. It is a coping strategy. It helps you to cope with stress, but it's also a predisposition in a sense that it works as a buffer against stress and stressful situations. So in this view, from this perspective, research has shown that this self-compassion is a predictor, or at least a correlate of well-being and resilience, especially in those instances where students face sudden stressors or changes. And also we have some research showing that this is actually, or the self-compassion has an important role in this transition phase to university, because it's a stressful situation, and it is a change of the environment for the students. So when we look at our first year students, they've had two recent sudden changes. So they've experienced this transition to higher education, and they've experienced this pandemic, and they then a rapid need to adapt to online teaching and online learning. So we found this really, well, it's a bit like a bad moment in a sense. It's not like we don't want this, but having said this, this is very interesting context to study self-compassion, because if self-compassion, or the role of self-compassion, is visible in some context, then this should be the context that we get some interesting results. So for the study, we have 3 research questions. How is self-compassion related to psychological well-being? What kind of self-compassion subgroups, student subgroups can be identified? And then how do these subgroups differ in their experiences of psychological well-being? And we collected the data last year, and we have about 700 first-year students from our university from various fields. And then up to that data collection point, they had attended their 6-7 months of higher education, mostly online, so they have only experiences of online higher education. And we had an electronic questionnaire. It was voluntary for the students to answer. We have about 50% of the first-year students in our data. So a few words about the questionnaire we used. So we have this shortened self-compassion scale with the 2 factors, self-criticism and self-compassion. Self-criticism was measured, for example, with an item, I'm disapproving and judgmental about my own flaws and inadequacies. And self-compassion with an item, I try to be understanding and patient towards those aspects of my personality I don't like. And then we have 3 concepts to address psychological well-being: self-efficacy from how you learn, and from MSLQ, or initially from MSLQ, and then this study-related burnout scale, and then workload. It was measured with a single item that the students wanted to add to our instrument after those focus groups. So it was an estimation, student estimation of the workload. Then we did some confirmatory factor analysis, and you can see from the table it's a quite nice data feed. We did some network analysis with the core package in R, and then some cluster analysis, and then one-way analysis to understand the interaction between the student subgroups and the psychological well-being factors. This is for the research question 1. How are these the self-compassion and the psychological well-being factors related to each other? You see the red links are negative correlations, and the blue ones are positive correlations. And the stronger the link, the stronger the correlation, and also the closer these 2 concepts are, the stronger they correlate. So we see a few things here. I don't know, is there a pointer? Yeah. Like, for example, we have self-compassion over here. There is actually, I don't know, there is a correlation here, but you can't see it. Sorry. But anyways, well, you see the strongest one, so it's important. So you see that these negative factors about this, like burnout, risk of burnout, they are very close to this self-criticism factor, and then also self-efficacy is here, like in the game, as predicted. But self-compassion, workload, they have some reasonable correlations, but they are not so much involved in this data. For the other research question, the second research question about the student subgroup. So we have we identified 4 student subgroups. The self-critical students, so they scored high on self-criticism and low on self-compassion. The mixed high students, so they have a relatively high values on both factors. the mixed flow students who have relatively low values of both factors, and then the self-compassionate students who score low on self-criticism and high on self-compassion. So no statistically significant differences in terms of study field, but women or female students are overrepresented in the self-critical group, and men are overrepresented in the mixed low subgroup. Okay, what happened? Okay, I pressed the wrong button. Never mind, never mind. Just to keep you awake. So for the third research question, the student subgroups and their relation to psychological well-being, I had a very horrible table that I deleted, so I will just explain you the results. I hope it's better for you. So first of all, these subgroups are different statistically significantly in all factors all that we had for the psychological well-being. And the tendency, which actually was true for all the factors, was that we have those subgroups from 1 to 4. So the subgroup 1 scored highest on those negative factors like burnout and workload, and the self-compassionate students scored the lowest. So they were less in risk of burnout, for example. And also for self-efficacy, well, it's a positive thing to be or report higher self-efficacy. So it was the self-compassionate students who reported higher self-efficacy values, and again the self-critical students reported the lowest self-efficacy values. And first of all, to draw some conclusions, the results support this idea that self-compassion can act, or it is a protective element in students' well-being against these sudden changes. Considering the well-being factors that we used. Also, what we saw from the results is that it's not so much about self-compassion or the presence of self-compassion, but lack of self-criticism that has this protective element. Because if you see these, if you look at this, the self-criticism values decrease when you go to the right, and the self-compassion values, they vary. So it was actually that self-criticism that was sort of determining those relations with the psychological well-being. Also, another result is that the students, so they don't they are not consistent in the ways they report on self-compassion and self-criticism, but they can actually report or have various combinations of those two factors. A few things about the connections to learning environments and to pedagogical implications. We have a pedagogical development program at our institution, and we are aiming to address not only the students, but also the teachers and the degree programs to address this pedagogical development on all levels. And I think it's very important to, especially when we do research on well-being, so from an ethical perspective, it's not okay to go and ask that, how is your well-being, and the students say that, oh, it's really bad, and then you're like, okay, thank you, fine. So you need to somehow be able to address those concerns that students have if you want to do research on those concerns. So for example, what I did with my colleague, when we collected the data, then we went back with for each degree program for the students, and then I had their data, for their group, and then we discussed about the findings of their own results. And it was really interesting because they talked about very practical issues. They didn't say that, oh, you need to just like fix my identity or anything like that. They talked about they were hoping for teachers not having deadlines on the same day, for example. And they talked about having clear instructions and a clear, like a Moodle pages, these online learning platform pages and so forth. So I don't know if it's, like if that's the first encounter and if there are like more challenges after that, so that is like the most urgent sort of pedagogical things that we should like fix or take care of, or if it's really so that the students really somehow consider their well-being on this practical level. If they do, it's really good for us because from like a teaching and pedagogical development perspective, it's much more easier to have clear instructions than to go deep into these psychological interactions with the students. And something, if you have any suggestions, I'm very happy to listen and hear them. We are having, as part of this pedagogical development program, we are collecting data 3 times for each student during their university study. And this was their first data collection, and we are having, this autumn, we are having the second data collection for these students. So I'm really, because we don't have access to the students before they came to our institution, so we kind of need to work like backwards. So we see, I'm really eager to see how, for example, these student subgroups, how they do in the second data collection point. And then we can, I hope, we can draw more practical and pedagogical implications when we see that what is actually going on when they have studied a bit longer than 6 months at a higher education institution. But for this longitudinal research design, I'm really waiting for your comments and suggestions. Let's see. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we again have 2 minutes for clarification questions. Please go ahead. Can you try to speak up a little bit?
Yes. 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 Yeah. Yes. Well, it is a difficult job to get students to answer, and what we did was that we identified, for each degree program, we identified one course that they were taking, that all students of that degree program were in it. And then we contacted the teacher of that course, and we said that, how about us coming to introduce what the research we do and this pedagogical development program, and to tell students about their role and how we want to use their data, and to tell about the importance of them responding. And then in that session, the students responded to the questionnaire. So yeah, during the session, yes. And then we also promised to go back with the data. So it was also, I hope it was motivating for the students to respond, and because they knew that then they will get their own data back, and they will discuss, or we will organize these discussion sessions for them. But even with this, we got only 50% of the students. So it's a lot, but still, like, I don't know what else we could do, like bribe them or something. I don't know.
It's a tough
Yeah.
business,
Yeah.
for sure. One more question? Yes, Miriam, please. Quick.
Yes. We have a second set of first-year student data already collected, so we continue that. And it's also then very interesting to see the how this COVID time looks in, for example, first-year student data and all that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now we will switch. And I hand over to Franziska, who will start our presentation. Please
Thank
go
you very
ahead.
much, Taiga, and you will continue in the second half. Welcome to our presentation on transition to university in the context of the pandemic, the relevance of belonging. Actually, it's a presentation of three of us, but unfortunately, Miriam hurt her ankle yesterday evening, and she cannot be with us, but her contribution has been very relevant here.
Yes, she is okay.
Yeah.
Just not able to be here at the moment.
So I would like to start with just the overall aim of our research and give you some more information about the context. So we follow up on the question which factors can explain different levels of student engagement of first-year students in teacher education under COVID restrictions. And we focus on the fall semester 20, but the data we are presenting has to be understood in a larger project. We started out at the beginning of the pandemic. We had an online survey, we had interviews, but when we had to switch to online again after starting the fall semester in 20, we thought, oh, it will be so important to follow up our first semester students and how they will be doing in this predominantly online start of their studies. And we went back with our data to the students and we tried to have a follow-up, but due to we are restricted in time, so we will just exclusively talk about this fall semester 20. As a theoretical concept, we follow what we already saw, Ella Tahu and Karen Nelson's framework. It's a cultural framework, and we follow the idea that student engagement might be a predictor of academic success. And we think it is very powerful as it really focuses on the actual student behavior, less so on the individual characteristics. And we have been following up the idea of these behavioral, cognitive, and emotional components of engagement, but to speak frankly, I think it's hard to really be conceptually precise to how those factors interact. And we also are intrigued by the idea that student engagement is a shared responsibility between the students and the institution, and that we really should have a close look at what Ella Tahu calls the educational interface. So we tried to put her framework in this regard, and you will recognize the colors later on when Taiga is presenting the regression analysis. So we are very interested in the relation of what she has pointed out as important constructs in the educational interface, such as self-efficacy, emotions, belonging, and well-being. And I see there is some relations to the presentations you have, but we also use different concepts, and I'm looking forward to see how we put all this together. And we tried to capture the learning environment. I think we haven't been as successful as you were, Mike, because we have it on the overall curricular perspective, and we also have a couple of student influences we will point out later on. So these are our three research questions. So we will be presenting results from three different programs within one University of Teacher Education, and we will follow up on the factors from the learning environment, from the student, and from the educational interface. And we try to point out the issue of belonging, as it seemed particularly relevant for the first year students. So for research methods, we conducted an online survey in the period of December 15 until the end of February. We had this online survey, and we are really proud that we got a response rate of over 50%, although students have been very burdened at that particular time. As I will show you some more information about the three different programs, and I could also provide you with more information about the scales and the instruments we use, but due to time restrictions, I won't present things in detail here. But we used mostly validated instruments and had fairly good statistical characteristics. So we made descriptive statistics, some ANOVAs, and also some regression analysis. And as context seems to be really relevant to also understand differences between programs, and I also think when we look at results, it's a very particular context. It's teacher education, and within teacher education we have three similar but very different programs still, and I would like to just give you a few insights. So we were looking at the Secondary 1 teacher education program, which is a master's in our system in Switzerland, 4.5 years. And what is particular in Zurich, in our institution in Zurich, is that they go to the University of Zurich to get particular introductory courses, and the rest of their studies they will do at the University of Teacher Education, which is a separate institution. So they choose subjects they are going to teach in the future. So you could imagine math, science, and maybe sports, or German, French, and history. So there are very different combinations. And we also have a specific version of that Secondary 1 program, which is only for students age 30 and over. They have to bring with them some qualification. It is also to be understood from the background of teacher shortage we are facing in Switzerland. Here it's a smaller cohort, so they know each other well, but they have been very burdened. In the first year they are full at the University of Teacher Education with us, and from the second year on they teach I think between 30 and 60% in a school. And then we have the maybe least complex program with primary education. It's also the largest program, so it's more or less in the first year at the same program for all. There is no choice in the first semester, and it is exclusively taught within our institution. So for the results, we had a look at student engagement, and for the first one, this is the whole scale, and here you can see 3 items within the scale, and we see a significant difference in engagement between the Secondary 1 program, the regular program, and the primary program. Overall, I would say a 3 is if you have 1 which is doesn't apply at all, and 5 fully applies. It's very mediocre values. In the spring we had higher values, so it has been really a challenging experience I see. And you also see significant differences in what we would call as behavioral engagement. I'm satisfied with my engagement in distance learning, or also for cognitive engagement in distance learning, I was able to deal with the learning content in depth. And what seems particularly remarkable is the huge standard deviation we have in the data. For the learning environment, and I'm really afraid this is too small, so we tried also to capture the characteristics of the learning environment, and what you can see is as the third one, we asked the modules I attended were offered synchronously during regular class time in the form of virtual classrooms. And here we see that the Secondary 1, the regular program, was much higher than the other ones. And in contrary, the fourth one, you could see the modules I attended were offered asynchronously, provision of content to be worked on, let's say text, video, and tasks to be carried out. Also there we have a significant difference. It's very much on the surface, but we see there have been quite some differences, and that probably it has to do with the secondary ones attending classes at the university, which has been larger audiences, I assume. We also have a significant difference in the level of group work involved. There the lateral entry experienced less group work. And what has been interesting to us throughout all the surveys we made, even if we have a contrast in asynchronous and synchronous activities, they will report about mediocre flexibility or structure. And this reminds me very much of what you said, Michael. There is this tendency, they need structure, but also flexibility. And I think this is one of the major things we need to be working on. What we see, so this is more on the descriptive level, and on the lowest level we see the modules for active learning. So we have a scale there to capture the active learning characteristic, and there we don't see any significant difference. So this is my last slide for the measurements we have in the educational interface. So we have self-efficacy. We have a significant difference between the lateral entry and the secondary one, but the difference is not very, very high. But in general, what we could see is that this older population has shown much more resilience, although the burden was really high, maybe having kids at home to be taught, studying online, working at schools. But this is something that is interesting. We have anxiety, which is not very low, but which is there. Enjoyment, and here we don't see any significant differences amongst the constructs. And now I will hand over to you, Tiger, to show the regression.
Exactly. Thank you, Franziska. And I try to be really quick. As Franziska introduced earlier, we try to use the same color coding as in the Kahua and Nelson model before to make this a little bit easier to comprehend. So what we have in our models is, first of all, we have the student influences, then model 2, learning environment, model 3, the educational interface, and then model 4, the whole picture. And we didn't do a multi-level model, we did hierarchical regression analysis because our data just wouldn't have fit the multi-level model. But what we can see here is that the student influences, and you can also see that with the R-square, they do not explain very much in our models. The only thing that is different, and Franziska already showed that, is the study program, but children in one's household and the employment didn't really make a difference in students' engagement, which I think is quite surprising, but maybe that's also because not very many have children in a household. What we can then see is that from the learning environment, and that already explains quite a bit of our variance, is that active learning really makes a difference for student engagement. And on the negative side, if students are missing contact with the lecturers, that also means that their student engagement is reduced, which is also not surprising, I would say. But what we find interesting also in the light of the SIG 01 is that feedback and assessment demands did not make a significant difference here. And then now we're switching to the educational interface, and as Franziska already introduced, we have 4 variables here, and you can see that all 4 variables at the educational interface significantly contribute to students' engagement. Of course, we might have some measurement problems here, but it's still, this is interesting, and also that the direction of the influence is quite in line with other research. And then if we look at the whole program, at the whole set of variables and the whole model, we can see that then anxiety is kind of leveling out. So this is probably maybe, you know, included in missing contact to the lecturers. We don't really know what's the issue there. But what we also found interesting is that belonging, you know, it's just below the significance level. So it's still relevant from our perspective, but statistically it's not significant anymore. So I'll leave this to have time for the discussion and conclusion. And I will go along the 3 research questions. So the first was just to describe how students perceive their student engagement. And we see the engagement is rather neutral or at a medium level. We see the significant differences between the degree programs that Franziska introduced, especially the students of the secondary regular program that's having these 2 institutions to focus on. Is experiencing more synchronous activities, and what we also saw is that the emotional belonging to the University of Teacher Education is rather low. And then we also looked into the factors that tried to explain the different levels, and as I just said, the educational interface is very relevant. This is in line with a lot of previous research, and also the interaction with the learning environment. That's basically why we did the symposium, seems very relevant. but student influences on a personal level are less relevant, at least for our student cohort. And we find the model by Cahu and Nelson very relevant, so it might be interesting to use this for more research. However, we also see the need for more fine-grained research. As I said, we cannot explain everything in our regression model. We do have qualitative data, but we haven't put this into this presentation. And the last research question was, how did students perceive social integration or their belonging? And overall, we can see medium values of belonging, we know that belonging is very important for students' relatedness or connectedness to the institution, so that's something that the University of Teacher Education might want to address in the future on a practical level, but we don't know whether this is due to the COVID semester. So what we need and what we are also aiming at is to have comparative data with non-COVID semesters. And we can modestly conclude that there might be some relations to the COVID restrictions, but we don't really know yet. And overall, I can say that this was a very interesting study where we looked at students' engagement during the COVID-19 restrictions. And of course, we didn't have longitudinal data, so we cannot really say what the effects are of the distance learning experience. We have only one single institution, even though some of the students, as we said, studied at the University of Zurich as well. So we're not sure, are the results generalizable for teacher education in general? And of course, the number of students, you saw that, differed quite a bit between the different programs, so that of course also affects our results. But to sum this up, we see that both the learning environment and the educational interface are highly relevant, and thank you for your attention. So I think we only have 1 minute for clarification questions because Franziska and I managed to run over time. Sorry for that. There's, Miriam. That's okay.
We also had hopelessness included.
But hopelessness and anxiety were so highly correlated that we decided to use anxiety because it's more, well, it sounds more like the original Cahu and Nelson model, what she had in there. Exactly. Oh, there's one more question. Yeah, I'll take it while I'm changing presentations.
I don't quite, couldn't understand.
Oh, I heard it,
Okay.
and actually, yes, there are other models, and Franziska and I actually prepared these models for a collaborative space that we did yesterday, unfortunately, but what we can offer you is to send you our handout. So if you just come and, yeah, different models for transition into higher education, and if you just leave your email address with me, I will send this after the session. So now it's my pleasure to hand this over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for preparing this. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be the discussant for this symposium. And wow, we are really here. I took this quote from an email from Taiga and Mikael in January, where they were still like, let's hope, fingers crossed, and now we're really here. While keeping an eye on those who didn't manage to get here, like Tobias, and really would like to recommend you to see his video that he and his colleague made. It's really high quality. So I see we're trying to make the best of both worlds here, and that's really so nice to see. And thank you, Taiga and Mikael, for having me as discussant. It really allowed me to travel a bit back in time. I did my PhD on the topic of transition from secondary to higher education, but during my postdoc years, I went more to SIG 1 assessment. So actually, this conference, I'm like a kid in a candy store at the moment. Being a discussant here allowed me to reconnect with the topics I was working on during my PhD, and also to see some people again, and also see how the field advanced, notably the model of Cahoon and Nelson I didn't know, so that's really nice to see how things elaborated further from there. So it was really some time traveling, it's really nice to do. The symposium's goals then were to investigate how students experience their learning environment during the transition to higher education, and then more specifically with the whole pandemic, as you heard in multiple presentations. And then with the ultimate goal in mind, how can we strive to foster teachers and institutions' awareness concerning their roles in students' transition to higher education? So what can they do to foster all that? I had 4 really interesting presentations, and as said, I will also give some feedback on the presentation of Tobias and his colleague. The first presentation was by Michael, and he focused on the transition and then specifically on instructional features and practices that are at play in that moment. Some strengths, when I was reading the first big draft of the paper, I really liked the combination of quantitative and qualitative research, and I guess you did the same while he was presenting. It also included different universities, that's really rare, and different disciplines, so that's really nice to see. As we're joining here with SIG 1, I also try to make some links with that SIG. And here I see in the teacher proximity, there's the element of constructive feedback, so that's really nice for those who are also a bit more feedback or assessment oriented. While reading, I of course had some suggestions and questions that I would like to share with you. The first one is of course reflection from my SIG 1 perspective a little bit more. You talk about continuous assessment, but then I was reading the verbatims, the citations from the students. It looked a little bit more like formative assessments, students having quizzes to know where they're at. So I really urge you to go look a little bit at that literature to make sure you're using the exact concept, because continuous assessment is a little bit more like you can validate already some credits during the year, and I had a feeling that maybe not all citations were in that line. And that would allow you to tap also into the broad literature that there is on formative assessment. At the moment you used grade point average as a dependent variable, if I'm not mistaken, but I was wondering from your way of entering the topic through the huge dropout in the first year of higher education, whether you're looking at passing or failing a course. We're in a full credit system in Belgium, so that means if you have a 10 out of 20 for a course, you get the credit, and well, if it's a 10 or an 11, well, that's not much such a big difference as a 10 or 9. So more logistic regression, I was wondering whether that could be a useful addition. What was not entirely clear, but maybe I just missed it, is whether some students were in multiple courses. No, you said no. So you can drop my if yes. So no, and I was wondering if that's not the case, I was wondering whether you're like mixing a little bit the effect of discipline and course with teaching practices. And I would urge you to, for example, report the success rate per discipline and per course, just to give an idea of that. In my head, some educational tracks in higher education have more attrition in the first year, and I think notably of the track we're teaching in and psychology students, but maybe I'm just completely making that up. So if you could give a bit more information on that, that would be really helpful. The second presentation by Julia here was also on the transition then, and then adapting to online teaching during the pandemic, and then notably the whole aspect of self-compassion, study-related burnout, and perceived workload. Also some strengths that I managed to get from the presentation And I prepared this before, so I may have missed some strength still. But I really like the fact that you were looking at the variation between students, and not just at the mean level, but working with profiles to see what's really in the whole, whether there's differences in the overall experience. And that you really asked yourself the question, like, okay, given these correlations between the concepts, what should we keep for future studies? Because of course, there's some new concepts being added, and what do they add compared to the concepts that were already there, and to be critical about that. So that I really applaud. Some suggestions and some questions. Reflection from the SIG1 perspective. In the SIG1, and notably the sessions on self-assessment and peer assessment, we're always trying to wonder how can we get these students to be a bit more critical regarding their own work, in light of the self-regulated literature, etc. And then reading your slides and hearing your presentations, I might add, but without becoming too self-critical. So how can we get them to be really critical about their work, without it sort of generalizing to themselves? So I was wondering if that could be a useful aspect to add in the reflections of your work. And this was in line with the question that was already asked, but it was of course a voluntary participation, and if I'm not mistaken, there were also multiple programs involved. You mentioned a response rate about 50%, if I got it correct. Would be useful also to give it regarding to the program, and to see if that's possible, if there are, for example, differences in percent of students that make it after the first year, or in GPA, just to see if your 50% more or less reflects the students in the different programs, if that's possible. The third presentation by Franziska and Taiga, also on the transition, and then on the extra difficulties that the whole COVID pandemic brought for students, and then focusing on engagement and social integration. Some clear strengths, also qualitative data. We didn't manage to dive really deep into that, but I was so pleasantly surprised to see that in the midst of the whole pandemic, you managed to do longitudinal interviews and focus groups. You must be really superhumans there. I was really pleasantly surprised to see that during that difficult time. Also really like the fact that you were focusing on diverse public. So there were full-time students, like our regular students, so to speak, and then also the second career teachers, which were predominantly over 30 years old, and so we already had some experience. So I really like the fact that you looked at multiple audiences there. And that you kept a strong eye on the diversity in the experience by looking at variance within the programs, by using your graphs and your intervals. I found that really an interesting approach to the diversity between and then within the programs. You didn't talk about it in the paper, but it was in the abstract. You made a comparison with data of 2016 as well, and that was in line with one of my suggestions. For comparisons, no, it's, oh, no, I missed it there, sorry. If it's possible, then I think, as Julia told, she was going to use a new cohort who doesn't have the whole corona issue with them, and I was wondering whether that would be very useful for you as well, to look into that. Some questions, suggestions that I had while going through your work. You mentioned the comparison with the 2016 data, but it was on the average level, I think. And I was wondering whether you could also look at the variance or standard deviation level. Because we know from other research that during the COVID pandemic, some students, it went really well, and others, it went really not well. So we just got the impression that the mean, it did not change so much, but with regard to the variation and the standard deviation, there might be some things happening. In line of what you call the within-program variance. You mentioned response rates, if I'm not mistaken, but it would also be interesting to see them per program, given the 3 very different programs you have. And I wondered whether at the moment you used one big regression analysis with students from the 3 programs. And I was wondering whether either 3 separate analyses would not be more valuable, for example, to see the impact of kids. As you mentioned, not a lot of students had kids, but the fact that you did not find an impact on that appears counterintuitive, as you just said. And I was wondering whether it could be due to the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, that program was treated as a quantitative variable in your analysis, while it's actually more a qualitative variable. So. And then the last one is a presentation you did not see by Tobias. Really, again, urge you to go see it because it's really interesting. I found it really nice to have it at the end of the symposium as well, because they focus on transition and the adaptation to the whole online teaching with regard to self-efficacy, but they use an intervention approach, and that was really interesting to see. They sent out an online intervention for a large cohort of students, so quite an ambitious work as well. Some strengths, they used a quasi-experimental design with an active control group that was working on reading strategies. So that's really, I think, in line with the most current recommendations for this kind of research. And they also looked at variances in experiences, so by using latent class analysis. Some suggestions and questions I had when looking at their video was that they found that intrinsic motivation decreased, but I was wondering whether their post-test score was close to the exam period, and we know there's a sort of seasonal effect of intrinsic motivation throughout the academic year, or at least throughout the school year in secondary education. I'd like to see more correlations on key variables in their study to know, in line with what other authors did, are all variables relevant or some replicating other variables? And then just a suggestion I had for them on missing data, but I will share it with them more in detail. That was all for me. Thanks again for having me for this interesting set of presentations, really having an eye on the transition, online teaching due to COVID, but then also really on the diversity and what teachers and programs can do. And well, that's it.
Thank you, Lucia.
I don't know how I did it on the time.
Perfect. And we really managed well, all of us, also because one presentation was missing, but I think it was a good decision to not transmit it, because it's just not very active to sit here and with these cozy chairs. Maybe some of you would have fallen asleep, but I hope you're still awake to ask some more discussion questions to Lishu, but also to the others. So please, the floor is now for the audience, or also for the 3 presenters, whether they have questions. Please, go ahead.
I'll try to be louder.
Yeah, great.
So I'm currently conducting a study in city on transition to higher education. These are cohort students that didn't quite qualify for stage 1 or year 1 program, so it's a preparation for stage 1. And we are finding that students are very, very, they don't come to classes, and there's a few percentage, I would say 20% is really engaged.
think the question is also, I mean, that's probably something that we would need some more information on to really give advice, so please feel free to also come up afterwards. But what I would suggest, and maybe you can add, is to look at your variables and whether they match one of the models that is already out there, because it's always important to have a theoretical framework in mind, and most likely, that's the good part, there is something that will match. So it's really, you know, it's not, probably not too hard to find this model, but you should try to find one. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but please feel free to come and talk to us later, to also describe your variables, and then we can discuss what might be a good fit.
Is that I'm staying true to my research process, right? Because I've already collected the data. So I was to stay true to my research process and how I actually put that in discussion framework. Just thinking aloud, you know?
Yeah. I get what you mean, but I think it's really something that we should just discuss as a follow-up thing, because it's really a strategic decision, and usually it's easier for the paper publishing process to have a model in the literature review, even though this is not true to your research process. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks for all the presentations. I have a very practical question, and I would like to use the expertise in the room. So, do you know what the differences are between the learning environments before they come to university or higher education when they arrive at higher education? Because what we realize is that actually all students are completely overwhelmed with the methods that we try to apply to get into active learning. And if we get an idea about the differences, we could do more concrete work on these problems. Because at the moment we are a bit lost in the fog, so to speak. But maybe you know have some ideas for us.
That is, do you want to add to this question? Yes, please. Can I just quickly add, and then you can ask your next question, because or maybe you also want to add. I think that's also something that we could maybe explore with these instructional quality dimensions that Michael had in his presentation, because as you, Miriam, also said, it's really interesting that this instrument actually comes from secondary research. So there is rich research on how this looks like in secondary research. And it would maybe be worthwhile to try to have this in higher education and compare it with the data on secondary education to see whether this is aligned, right, the instructional qualities, or whether there's a total mismatch, as you said. Franziska?
Just add another perspective on
Sure.
your question. One is really the difference in learning environment, but when we have the qualitative interviews with the students, I think what is really important is also the relationships and the role perception. What is the difference between a university student from being a high school student? And they don't meet a consistent counterpart of what it means to be a university lecturer. And to navigate this process in transition is another path to follow, not just the characteristics of the learning
Now I think Bernadette first for your question, please.
My question was for the organizer of the symposium and the author. It's really good thing you have picked your goal for the symposium because I think that the question exploring the role of the learning environment, yes, we have some answer to say that it's important. And we know that it's active learning and so what I would call the pedagogical progress and the presence of but the question on the diversity, for me, it's not so clear. It's just a question. Do you answer to this question or the diversity and the composition? If you take into account the learning environment?
Yeah.
Well, some more, some less, I would answer. So for Franziska and our presentation, that was really relevant because we really had these high diversity also in the student population. But for you, maybe that was less relevant because you had more traditional students. And I know that for Tobias, you know, they wanted to kind of also level out the diversity with their intervention. And Julia, you can answer yourself what you think, how diverse your population was.
Well, I think it was representative of the students in Hamburg, but I didn't actually ask them what to happen or to address this diversity and the environment. I think we need to raise the long period to actually see how groups are performing so that we can address these differences between student groups and then suggest some pedagogical implications to address this diversity.
If I
It's not like one size fits all. That is one addressing diversity, so we need to address
if I may add to that, I think maybe diverse is just at the wrong place in the title because all of the presentations really had an eye on, okay, we're not just looking at the average student here, but really trying to see what groups are in there. So maybe it's how students, and in some presentations was also multiple groups that were really distinct, like the secondary career teachers, but in our presentations, how students perceive their transition and how does this differ between students. And I think that was really a strong point of all the four contributions. So it was there, it's just on the wrong place in the title, in my view.
Jonas?
I just had another perspective on the question you asked
Please,
now.
please go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that we could also regret these learning environment from the qualitative work on adjustment on students. For instance, like the work of private line, and we can have just one way to
Yeah? Yes, please.
I have a more open question about what happens now after the COVID, because I know that from the students' experience now in the first years, they have experienced online learning or little time during the last 2 years when they were in secondary education, and now they are coming to higher education. And I'm just wondering if the kind of the role of the learning environment, as it was analyzed in both of your students, then sometime that
wants to try a quick answer because we're running out of time?
Quick answer, yeah, maybe just one quick answer for that is that it really shows the importance of this kind of symposium and this kind of research, obviously. So we are showing here that the environment really matters and that it has a tremendous effect on academic achievement. So I think with this research we are on the good way to just show that it would be important and that it matters for the students. So that could be a good argument because before it was complicated to just have strong information to say you need to come back because we have strong argument to say that it's effective. So I think we need to go further. No,
I don't know.
No, but it's very high.
Yeah, there's.
May I add to this?
Yes, please.
I don't really think that new questions arise. I think our research showed that the very old core questions of good learning are important. When we talk about how much in presence and online, I think it's the wrong question. It's about how to make it relevant for very different students. It's really about the balance to give structure and not and have enough autonomy. We have seen students who really kind of got energized. Finally, I can follow my questions, and I'm not so much in there. I think it's the very old questions again.
Okay, first in the back, and then we move forward. Sorry.
Just on specific data that you showed that qualitative data, where you showed that what the teacher does is really motivating them. I can't remember if this is the third or the second or the third.
I think it was actually
Is that
Michael's.
the first?
Yeah.
I just want to know, did you, in your data, did you see what lecturers did to just ruin it for them, to the qualitative data?
What do you mean?
Like, they could have said that the lecturer just wasn't engaged in specific activity, was engaged in specific activity that it just put them off from learning, you know? Because it shows them positive examples, right? I'm wondering, in your data, do you have any example that the teachers just wasn't able to infuse the students? Was tried to infuse but didn't work.
Yeah, let me think. Like this, I cannot find a very specific example. No, I don't have it for the moment. But if you want, we can talk about this just after because for now I don't have a specific example like I think about it.
Yeah, but that's a relevant question.
Yeah.
Whether there's also the other way around. Yes, thank you.
That's true.
Just do it, you know, and there's some examples of what you can do. But I'm sure that some teachers tried something and it
And didn't work. Yeah.
what they were, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it
It's
did.
interesting.
Yeah, it didn't really pop out from the student perspective. I think if we just asked to the teacher, maybe, but here, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe
Yeah.
because the student might not even recognize it, but the teacher
Yeah.
might have realized that was something that did not work.
Yeah.
So now I take the two last comments and then we have to close this, unfortunately.
This question was mine and was a new research question. For me, there is one new research question, but also a lot more. But it's focused on students' learning co-configuration. It's a word, it's a concept used by Peter Questionnaire, and he really does try to understand the learning experiment or the new learning environment built by the students in interaction with several learning environments. And because the learning environment are so changing for the moment,
Yeah.
I think that this focus, learning co-configuration or co-construction is really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's a new perspective.
So the next step won't be to focus on the learning environment, but the learning environments.
The learning environments built by the students.
Yeah.
Learning environment,
Yeah.
the interaction with the one offered by the teacher.
Yeah, that's a really helpful comment, and I also wonder whether this is connected. The co-configuration by Goodyear is this connected to the co-construction. That's also a similar construct, probably. Julia, did you want to add something? You have raised your hand earlier. That's fine. Okay, great. That's wonderful because this is now the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
part of it. And I think there's a coffee break over there. Thank you.
Thank you.